Hello and welcome back. Now, usually I like to jump right into the schedule, but I found a literal gold mine that I want to bring to everyone's attention. So if you like free money, then pay attention right now. Jack Hughes is on an absolute heater. He's on a 5-game goal streak with 8 goals, 10 points in those 5 games, but the easiest money you'll make all year is the Jack Hughes shot prop. He hasn't had a game below 5 shots since December 21st, and you'll be getting plus money if you bet the over 5 shots per game with Hughes, and I did that last night and he cashed it by the end of the first period. Absolutely insane what Jack Hughes is doing right now, and as much as it pains me as a Rangers fan, as a fan of the game of hockey, this is incredible, and it's an easy way to make money right now, so don't say I never did anything for you. But with that said, let's jump right into the Week 14 schedule to help you maximize your waiver ads for the next week. And right off the bat, there are 50 games this week, and 72% of the weekly schedule is Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. So you need some help on those light nights. And although nobody plays the perfect Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday schedule, there are a few teams with multiple games on light nights. So you can think about dropping any Ducks, Hawks this week. If you picked up any non-essential Bruins, Golden Knights, Caps, they could all potentially be dropped as all 4 or 5 of those teams only play twice. 9 teams, however, do play 4 times this week, and some of those 4-game schedules are better than others. Now, this segment is essentially brought to you by The Point Fantasy on NHL Radio. Boomer and Jake do a great job breaking down the schedule, and they highlighted a bunch of important things that we'll go over here, but I do want to give credit where it's due. Basically, listening to that show was the first step I took towards becoming a better fantasy manager several years ago. And if you want another resource to help your team, they air the fantasy show Fridays at 2 p.m. on NHL Radio on Sirius XM. But the best schedule this week belongs to the Edmonton Oilers, a 4-game week, 3 pretty weak defensive teams, and 3 of the 4 off nights. So you likely want to own some Oilers, but the problem is that all the guys you want are clearly owned up. So is there anyone on Edmonton that we can find some fantasy value from? No, not really. McDavid, Draisaitl, Nurse, Nugent-Hopkins, Hyman, Kane, Barrie, and Bouchard. Those are the guys you're going to want to own. Those are the guys at the top of the player hub right here on the right, but they're all above 57%. Now, Bouchard is 57% owned, so he's maybe the most ownable of this bunch, but basically, as a fantasy manager, there's not a single player on the rest of this team that I would want exposure to. But if you're in a 28-team league or something crazy like that, you could try one of these 3 guys. Right now, according to Daily Fantasy, Klim Kostin and Kailer Yamamoto are on the top line with McDavid. And we've seen this before. You notice a guy playing with the best player in the world, you pick him up, but because it's Edmonton, the guy you picked up does nothing, and Connor McDavid has a 5-point night, and it's all on the power play or something. But with that said, Kostin is a hits guy as a forward who's worked his way into the top line, 3 goals in his last 6 games, and 20 hits for 3.33 hits per game, so at least he'll cover hits even if he's not producing. Yamamoto is not that attractive. He's a single position right wing, 3 points in his last 6. Puljujärvi, 2% owned, also a single position right winger, and he's playing third line right now. So neither of those guys are particularly enticing. Aside from that, if you like the Hail Mary, you could potentially try Dylan Holloway, who had a goal the other night against the Isles. He's 1% owned. There's also Philip Broberg, 1 assist in his last 4, 0% owned, but seriously, I wouldn't own a single one of these players, even in a 4-game week like this. And the reason being, this player ranking is how complete a player is in a league with hits and blocks. And so that's the league that I'm in. So none of these guys are above 50%. And I wouldn't want exposure to any of them unless they were, 90th percentile in one specific category, but none of these guys are. So the next best schedule this week is the Winnipeg Jets, who play the back half of the off nights on Friday and Sunday, and they do have some favorable matchups. So in addition to that, they just got some major reinforcements back in the lineup, including Nick Ehlers, Blake Wheeler, Cole Perfetti, and Nate Schmidt. On top of all that, the Jets have 14 games in the next 25 days, including 4 this week and 4 next week. So there is a lot to be mined in terms of fantasy value in Winnipeg. They're a very good team, good offensive team. And this week they have a couple of mid-pack defensive teams that they're playing and a couple of teams that could give up a bunch of goals. So who can you target from Winnipeg? Well, right off the bat, Neil Pionk, 50% owned. He does get some power play time, a goal, an assist, a power play point in his last 3 games. He's a guy that is typically going to get you a couple more hits than what you would get out of a replacement level defenseman. And he's, again, getting the top 4 minutes, the top power play. Used to be the top power play. Now it's Morrissey. So they kind of switch off back and forth. But he's a pretty reliable option, especially in an 8-game, 2-week stretch. Now, Blake Wheeler, you got to give him credit for playing through a ruptured testicle. That's absolutely insane. 50% owned, single position right wing, 26 points in 30 games on the year, 7 power play points, 66 shots. But that line, when it was Blake Wheeler, Mark Scheifele, and Cole Perfetti, they were very productive. And speaking of Cole Perfetti, he's 14% owned. He's 3-position eligible, which is a little bit more valuable in fantasy. And he gets you that top 6 exposure under 50% ownership. Now, that stretch that I was just talking about was from November 21st to December 9th. And Perfetti was doing pretty well in that garden seat with Wheeler and Scheifele. He had 10 points in those 10 games, 3 goals, 7 assists. So this is a potential something that you want to keep an eye on. If you have an ad, this is going to get you a player that's going to get in the lineup almost every game, even if it's a heavy night, because he can play center, left wing, or right wing for your team. So he's getting you that top 6 exposure where he was a point per game. And then on top of that, again, 4 games this week, 4 games next week. Now, if you're in a face-off league, you probably already know about Adam Lowry, but if you're not, 10% owned, 2 assists, 9 shots, 15 hits in his last 5 games. But if you're in a league that has shorthanded goals or shorthanded points, he has 2 shorties on the year and a shorthanded assist. If you're in a face-off league, that makes him a little bit more valuable. If you're in a league that has shorthanded points, that makes him a little bit more valuable as well. He drops to the third-line center spot, but sometimes when these players are playing top 6 and they get slotted where they're supposed to be, their production can increase. So that's something to keep an eye on over the next 2 weeks, as they do have that schedule, 8 games over the next 2. So this is a potential gold mine in terms of fantasy, because this team actually scores goals. So you might actually get some production even out of some of these lower ownership guys. Now, just looking at Blake Wheeler, because we were just talking about him, 90th percentile in points per game, 85th in goals per game, 91st in assists per game, getting the 2.2 shots per game, and 83rd percentile in power play points. Doesn't get a lot of hits or blocks, but for the offensive categories, again, this is a guy that you probably want ownership of. He's 50% owned right now, so if you're in a deeper league, maybe you're not going to be able to afford Blake Wheeler, but if you're in a shallower league, again, this schedule sets up really nicely for the top 6 in Winnipeg. Now, up next, we have the Nashville Predators, and this is another tricky one because they have 3 matchups that will likely provide some offense, but they're also 27th in the league in goals for and last in the league in goals above or below expected at -24. But Nashville has 4 this week and 4 next week. So are there any Preds you'd want to potentially own for 2 weeks? Before we get to the ads, how about UC Saros? 64 saves against arguably the second best team in the NHL. He gave up 3 goals and still had a .955 save percentage that game. So incredible for UC Saros. But there are a lot of Preds available on the waiver wire. Now, only Yossi, Forsberg, and Duchesne are owned up. So the question is, what does your team need? So let's go through it. I'll go through these very quickly. If you want top line exposure and PP1 exposure, Juuso Parssinen, 1% owned. He's centering the top line with Forsberg and Sissons. 5 assists in his last 6, 2 power play points, 15 hits. So a guy that's going to get you top line, power play 1, and some hits coverage as well. If you want top line and no power play exposure, Colton Sissons, 1% owned, 5 points in his last 6, 3 goals, 2 assists. So a little bit more balanced than Parssinen. If you want power play 1 exposure for no apparent reason, Thomas Novak, 3 goals, 1 assist, 16 shots in his last 6 games. He's basically 1% owned. If you want an all-around defenseman for the next 2 weeks, this is probably the guy to go with. Matthias Ekholm, 10% owned, 4 points in his last 6, 2 goals, 2 assists, a power play point, 13 shots, 11 blocks as well. So he's getting some shots and blocks coverage, not a ton of hits, but he's covering a little bit of everything, getting some offensive production as well. If you want goals and hits with some shots thrown in as well, you have Nino Niederreiter, 15% owned, single left wing position, 4 points in his last 6 games, 20 shots, 14 hits. And he's a guy that I've been talking about all year, mainly as a goals, shots, and hits guy. He's above 80th percentile in each of those categories, so he's a guy that's more consistent. As you can see here, he's the 3rd highest rated player on the Data Draft Player Hub with hits and blocks. So he's a consistent producer in terms of shots, hits, and goals. Yakov Trenin, however, 5 points in his last 6, 3 goals, 2 assists, 15 shots, 16 hits. So he's had a nice week or two, and he's a guy that has been basically bottom 6, but he's a guy with some offensive scoring touch, and he does like to go out there and throw the body around. But if you just want massive hits volume, you still have Tanner Jeannot, 21 hits in his last 6 games, 3.5 per game. He ranks 99th percentile this year in hits. So he's still hitting, even though the offense isn't necessarily there, but he does have 2 assists in his last 6. But the guy that you're going to probably want to add because he's a defenseman is Jeremy Lauzon, 1% owned, 22 hits in his last 6, 3.66 per game, 97th percentile in hits, and he also had a goal and 2 assists in his last 6 games. So that's a little bit of offense thrown in, and it's a better position to have your hits guys in than a guy who's just a single position right winger like Jeannot. I ran out of room on this slide, but I still haven't mentioned Mikael Granlund. 5 assists in his last 6, 1 power play point, and he's 11% owned. Ryan Johansson, I wouldn't recommend picking him up, but he's 15% owned for some reason, and he's available on the waiver wire. You also have Cody Glass, 1% owned, 7 points in his last 9, 2 goals in the last 3 games on top of that, and he's basically a middle 6 forward who can get moved up and down the lineup. So there are options all up and down this lineup for whatever category coverage you need. Whatever categories are heavily weighted in your league format, you're going to want to try to target Nashville guys over the next 2 weeks. Again, 4 games this week, 4 games next week, and next week most of those games are at home at Bridgestone Arena. So this is a nice schedule for the next 2 weeks if you wanted to pick up some of these guys for specific category coverages, or if you're in a points league with specific weighting. This is the team that you want to mine some fantasy value out of. And that brings us to the best of the rest. So these are some targets for the teams that play 4 times. And we'll start with Barrett Hayton. But before I do, I went over a lot of the Coyotes ads in the Week 12 video. So if you need more options, check that out because guys like Richie, Krause, etc., they're all still there. But lately, Barrett Hayton has been getting it done. 1 goal, 5 assists, 1 power play point, 15 shots in his last 6 games. So maybe he's starting to find it. High draft pick that just hasn't worked out yet. But, this is a guy I wouldn't necessarily rely on in terms of consistency. But if you like riding hot streaks, he's definitely hot right now. Same type of thing with Casey Middlestat. And this is a case of finding a great offensive team and plucking a deeper option. Because by now, you all know about the top 6. The Thompsons, Tucks, Skinner, Cousins, Peterka, Quinn. You know about all of those guys. Middlestat has been heating up despite all of those guys taking up a lot of the oxygen. 2 goals, 4 assists, 6 points, a power play point in his last 6 games, and he's only 3% owned. So again, another hot streak that you could potentially ride. Now, as we turn to Carolina, first things first, if Pacioretty is available on your wire, he's only 63% owned. So if he's there, stop what you're doing, pause the video, go to your waiver wire, and pick him up right now. 2 games, 2 goals, 1 power play point, 8 shots. He had 6 shots in his first game back from that Achilles injury, and he looked very good last game against Columbus. But if you need a D-man, Brady Shea has been pretty offensive lately, and in his last 2 games, 2 goals, 1 assist, a power play point, and 8 shots. He's had back-to-back multi-point games at a couple different points in the last month. He's 29% owned, so he's becoming a little bit more of an offensive option if you need that offensive D-man to replace a guy like John Carlson. For Montreal, nobody's really worth owning at this point, but Yoel Armia, 3 goals in his last 2 games. He's 0% owned, but didn't want to necessarily highlight anything going on in Montreal right now. Things are a little bit grim, despite the fact that they're kind of salivating over potentially adding Bedard at the draft. Now, Ilya Mikheyev is a much safer option than the previous 2 forwards on here, and he's only 5% owned, despite being dual position eligible as a winger and with 6 points in his last 5 games. And on top of all that, he's playing top 6 with Horvat and Besser. He does get power play time. It's not PP1, but he does see some power play time as well. So for 5% ownership, you could do a lot worse than Ilya Mikheyev, especially in a 4-game week this week. And that brings us to the second best player in fantasy last week, and that is Vince Dunn. So I picked him up 2 weeks ago to try to replace John Carlson. Since then, 2 goals, 4 assists, 2 power play points, 13 shots, 15 hits, and over that span, Yahoo rank 16. But last week, he had back-to-back multi-point games for a goal, 2 assists, 14 shots, and 14 hits, which comes to 3.5 per game for each shot and hits category. If you look at his player hub, he covers assists, power play points, he gets some hits and blocks, and he's above 58th percentile in every category. So he's a bit more complete than a guy like Larson or Schultz, who you can also probably have on the waiver wire. But yeah, as you can see, his overall 73 rating means he's very good for hits and blocks leagues, as he covers a little bit of everything, and he's going to get you basically elite assist coverage and almost elite power play coverage as well. And he popped off last week, so we got to give it up to Vince Dunn. But in a nice 4-game week, you can also add Adam Larson. You can see the schedule at the bottom there. Larson, over the last 2 weeks, 1 goal, 4 assists, 20 shots, 23 hits, 13 blocks. So I mentioned 2 weeks ago that Larson is becoming the ultimate hits and blocks D, and at that time he was 34% owned. So if you listened and picked him up at that point, this is what you got since then, and now you see his ownership. So he's probably not there for you in some deeper leagues where he would have been potentially there for you 2 weeks ago when I mentioned him. He's 94th percentile in hits, 98th percentile in blocks, and he also adds some offense there. Now, in the last 2 weeks since I gave that out, these are the stats, but he ended up being Yahoo ranked 12 during that span, edging out Vince Dunn, and the reason is because he's a little bit more complete in terms of the hits and blocks coverage, and when he's adding 5 points in 6 games, that kind of boosts him above a guy like Vince Dunn, who did have a pretty good week himself. Now, one last player you need to pay attention to is Jared McCann. So, one of the best goal scorers in the league, and he's only 21% owned. Dual eligible center left wing. He has a 3-game goal streak right now. He had another 3-game goal streak in the last month, and he's got 7 goals in his last 11 games. So if you look at his player hub, 98th percentile in goals, which is what you see here in green. That is elite level. He's one of the best goal scorers in the entire NHL. On top of that, he's 80th percentile in power play points. You'd like to see the shots come up a little bit. This kind of indicates that his shooting percentage is high, but that also means that he's very skilled at putting the puck in the net. So if you're in a league where it weights goals and power play points heavier, he's definitely a must own. And just a reminder, if you want access to any of the player hubs you've seen here, just click on the Patreon link in the description below. Now, just a quick heads up, I mentioned this yesterday on Instagram. Next week, not this upcoming week, but the next week, week 15, the Flyers have a unicorn schedule, 5 games in 1 week. And as we speak, the Flyers have won 4 in a row, beating some of the bottom feeders in the league. They've beaten the Sharks, the Kings, the Ducks, the Coyotes. But everyone outside of Konechny and D'Angelo are ownable in fantasy. So if you look at it, Morgan Frost is supposedly the top line center right now, 8% owned, dual position eligible, 1 goal, 4 assists, 5 points, 2 power play points, and 8 shots in just the last 2 games. And that's incredible for a guy who's, I don't know if he's technically still a rookie, but he's very young and playing important minutes for the Flyers right now. He basically has taken the spot of Kevin Hayes, who was in the doghouse a little bit. He's 25% owned. He also had 5 points in his last 2 games, a goal and 4 assists with a power play point. on there as well. Joel Farabee's in the top 6, 3% owned, dual eligible, 2 goals, 1 assist in his last 2 games. You also have Scott Lawton, 19% owned, dual eligible again, 2 goals, 3 assists, 5 points, a power play point, 7 shots, and 6 hits in his last 4 games. And he's a little bit more complete, which is why he's higher up on the player rankings. Now, I didn't add Owen Tippett. I've talked about him a number of times in the past. He's good for shot volume, some hits coverage, and he's getting some offensive production now as well. He's another guy that you could potentially look to add. But then I did want to highlight Ivan Provorov. I've mentioned him before as a hits, blocks, and shots defenseman. 43% owned, so he may be there for you in shallow leagues. A goal, an assist, 8 shots, 4 hits, 10 blocks in his last 4 games. And again, they have 3 games this week, and then they've got 5 games in week 15, which is what we're trying to plan for a little bit ahead of the time. So, of course, in a 5-game week, the backup goalie will get in, and his name is Samuel Ersson, and he's been great over the last 2 weeks, as you can see right here. 2.0 goals against, 930 save percentage, and 3 wins in 3 starts. And he'll get at least 2 starts in that 5-game week, and he might get 1 start this week. So if you need a goaltender, I usually don't recommend taking goalies on a team that's 24th in expected goals against. But in a heavy volume week, if you're in need of a goalie, that Duck start is winnable. So is that Chicago game, and maybe even that Detroit game that you see down here in this particular week. But this is a place where you can mine some fantasy value in terms of goaltending. He's actually outplayed Carter Hart a little bit, though Hart has kind of gotten his game a little bit back in order with a 913 in 1 start. Now, fantasy performance through 14 weeks, still first place in the faceoff league, still undefeated. First in my main league, the THHL, but I do have to tip my cap to the Toe Dragons, who beat me last week 5-3. Toe Dragons actually has put together what I consider to be the best team heading into the second half of the season. I'm 4th place in the Data Draft League, though I'm scheduled to win this week and potentially move up. And I'm 4th in the other league that I'm in, where I'm still waiting on Evander Kane to come and rescue my team. But one last thing I wanted to do, I put a thread out there in the Discord group to see if the don't draft a goalie in the 1st or 2nd round principle is still holding up. So you can see at the top, in my league, Lake Mohawk Moose drafted Shesterkin 7th overall. He currently sits in 6th place. I'm playing him this week, and I'm up 7-1, but it could get a lot closer as he's got 4 games in hand. Portland Rivercats picked Vasilevsky 8th overall. He sits in 12th place, so he's not doing too well. And then the Crash Line picked Jake Ottinger in the 2nd round, which is actually a very nice play. He's in 2nd place right now. He also has Matthews, Jack Hughes, Eric Carlson, and he's put together a solid team overall. Then I asked the Discord group to show me their results, and a few of them responded, and you see them here. So here in this league, the numbers are where they were drafted, where they drafted their first goaltender. So the highest rated player that drafted their goalie in the top 2 rounds is this guy right here. He drafted in the 2nd round, but everyone else is at the bottom of the league. 2nd, 3rd, 1, 2, 3. This guy drafted goalies in 3 straight draft picks, which I would not advise. Then you look at this one. This guy, the show, is number 1 in his league. He drafted Shesterkin in the 1st round. He sits in 1st place, but he also drafted Marner, Pasternak, Dahlin, Stützle, Marchand, John Carlson, and many other picks that he's hit complete home runs on. So we'll get back to that in just a second. We'll take a look at Mighty Duck Mark's team, or his league rather. And this is a salary cap league. So you see everyone who drafted a goalie is outside of the top 3 or 4 overall. So this guy drafted a goalie. This guy, all the guys highlighted here, drafted goalies in the first 3 rounds, and none of them are higher than 5th place. So this goes to show you that you can draft a goalie high in the 1st or 2nd round if you hit on every other pick in the top 6 rounds and then get some help elsewhere. So this guy, the show, he drafted Marchand. He probably got him much later, and he's hit on pretty much every other one of his picks. But if you look at this sample, 14 of the 16 teams who chose a goalie in the first 3 rounds are outside of the top 3. So it means if you pick a goalie in the 1st round, you have a 12.5% chance of reaching the top 3. And if you're playing for money, that means winning your money back at the very least. So This goes to show you that you can potentially do it. You can draft a goalie in the first couple rounds and make it, but you essentially have to go perfect with every other pick in the top 6 rounds. And that's statistically not likely. So if you're trying to keep track of this, again, 12.5% chance of reaching the top 3 if you draft a goalie in the first 2 rounds. And that means an 87.5% chance of missing getting your money back or making any money if you draft a goalie in the top couple of rounds. But that's going to do it for this video. If you want any of the player hubs or rankings used in this video, just visit the Patreon link in the description below. Remember to like and subscribe. I'm trying to reach 2,000 before the All-Star break. Follow me on Instagram at data_draft for some shorter form content and quick updates. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.